Welcome to today's Explainer. So, today we are diving right into the Indian Contract Act of 1872. Specifically, we're looking at sections 37 through 44. Now, I know what you might be thinking, but this isn't just dusty legal theory. It's actually the invisible rulebook of everyday business fairness. It's the framework that makes sure when promises are made, they actually hold up in the real world.
Okay, consider this scenario for a second. If you hire a famous, world-renowned painter to do your portrait, can they legally just send their assistant to do the job instead? It's a pretty relatable question, right? And it perfectly highlights that contract law isn't just about exchanging money. It's incredibly specific about exactly who must perform an obligation and exactly how it gets done. Keep that painter in the back of your mind, because we're going to answer that exact question very shortly.
To keep things moving efficiently, here's exactly how we'll unpack these rules today. We'll start with the anatomy of performance, then move right into the rules for valid offers. Third, we'll figure out who does the work. Fourth, we'll untangle succession versus assignment. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at surviving joint promises. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, the anatomy of performance.
Under Section 37, the law draws this really fascinating distinction between actually doing the work and just trying to do the work. Actual performance is exactly what it sounds like, fulfilling the obligation exactly as you promised. Think of repaying a 500,000 rupee loan strictly on time. But then we have this thing called attempted performance, which is also known as a tender of performance. Basically, if you take goods to a buyer during regular business hours and they simply refuse delivery, well, your attempted performance still completely counts. You have legally fulfilled your duty.
Literally, even if the other party totally drops the ball and refuses your delivery, your attempted performance means you've fulfilled your slice of the contract pie. The law basically acknowledges that, hey, you stepped up and did your part.
Moving on to Section 2, Rules for Valid Offers.
Now, you can't just throw a half-hearted attempt at someone and call it a day, right? To transform an offer into a legally valid tender, it has to meet some pretty strict conditions. First off, it absolutely must be unconditional. So offering to repay only the principal on a loan, but skipping the agreed-upon interest? Yeah, that doesn't count. Second, it requires the proper time and place. Third, the other party needs a reasonable opportunity to actually examine the goods. And fourth, it must cover the whole obligation, the whole shebang.
Let's look at that proper time and place requirement. Say you promise to deliver goods and you just randomly show up at a warehouse at 2 a.m. Well, unless you've specifically agreed to some sort of night shift delivery, this is absolutely not a valid tender. Plus, if you deliver, say, 1,000 kilograms of wheat, you have to do it under circumstances where the buyer actually has a chance to inspect it. I mean, they need to know what they're paying for.
The whole obligation rule is totally crucial here. If you promise 100 bales of cotton but only offer 80, that's just not a valid tender. And this gets even stricter when we're talking about services. Imagine a singer contracts to perform 2 nights a week for 2 whole months, but then willfully misses her 6th night. The theater manager is completely within their legal rights to just cancel the entire contract. Partial performance? It just doesn't cut it.
Which brings us to Section 3, Who Does the Work? This covers Sections 40 and 41.
And this perfectly resolves our opening hook. Contracts fundamentally fall into 2 different buckets. If a contract relies on personal skill or personal confidence, like our world-famous painter, the promisor themselves has to do the work. They absolutely cannot delegate it to an assistant. And sadly, if the painter dies before finishing, the contract completely ends. But if there's no personal consideration, like paying a standard financial debt or delivering ordinary goods, the promisor can totally just hire a competent agent to handle it. And if the promisor dies in this scenario, their legal representatives have to fulfill the contract, but only up to the value of the property they actually inherited.
Then we have Section 41, which introduces this really fascinating strategic twist. Imagine you owe 100,000 rupees. A total stranger steps in, pays 60,000 to your creditor, and your creditor accepts it. Well, under the law, that creditor cannot turn around later and sue you for that 60,000. And get this, that's true even if you had absolutely no idea the stranger paid it. Because the creditor accepted the performance from a third party, your personal burden is legally knocked down to just the remaining 40,000. Pretty wild, right?
Okay, on to Section 4, succession versus assignment.
These next two concepts dictate exactly how contractual rights are passed on, and honestly, they are so easy to confuse. First up is succession. This happens automatically by process of law, so when a son inherits an estate, he succeeds to the contracts, meaning he takes on both the benefits and the burdens. However, and this is a huge vital protection, his liability is strictly limited to the value of the inherited property. He's not personally on the hook for his dad's excess debt out of his own pocket.
Assignment, on the other hand, is completely different. The golden rule here you need to remember is this. You can assign the benefits of a contract, but you absolutely cannot assign the liabilities. Why? Well, because you can't just force a random third party onto your creditor. A creditor can assign their right to collect a debt to someone else, for sure. But a debtor, they cannot just pass off their obligation to pay onto a stranger and walk away clean. You simply can't assign a burden.
Finally, we've reached Section 5, Surviving Joint Promises, covering Sections 42 through 44.
So what exactly happens when a contract is basically a group project? Well, under Section 42, if persons A, B, and C jointly promise to pay D 600,000 rupees, they must jointly perform that promise. But the law actually plans for the worst to ensure things transition seamlessly. If A passes away, A's legal representatives immediately step right into A's shoes to pay alongside B and C. And if all three die, all their respective legal representatives must step up and handle it together.
But here's where it gets highly strategic for the person actually collecting the debt. Under Section 43, unless there's a specific agreement saying otherwise, the person owed the money can legally force just one joint promisor to perform the entire promise. That's right, the creditor doesn't have to waste time chasing all three people down. They can just force person A to pay the entire 300,000 rupees. But don't feel too bad for person A, because the law says A can then turn around and legally force B and C to reimburse him for their equal shares.
Now, what if one of your co-promisors goes bankrupt? The law has a default sharing of loss rule built in. If A, B, and C jointly owe 300,000 rupees and C goes totally insolvent, the creditor can still force A to pay the entire 300,000, but now A and B have to share the loss of C's share equally. So A is legally entitled to recover exactly 150,000 rupees from B. Lastly, Section 44 deals with releases. Say a creditor decides to be nice and let one joint promisor off the hook. Maybe they officially release person A from the debt. Well, that absolutely does not discharge B and C. They are still fully liable to the creditor. And to top it off, just because the creditor released A is still not completely free and clear. Person A remains legally responsible to contribute to B and C if they end up having to pay the debt. So as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Think about the serious, everyday implications of joint liability. If you sign a joint promise and the creditor generously releases your partner, you are still entirely on the hook for the whole obligation. And your partner, they still owe you their share. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Who are you signing your next contract with? I really hope this structured look at the Contract Act empowers you to navigate these everyday business rules with a lot more confidence. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.